Welcome to Little Story Corner, where real-life stories are told. Please sit back and enjoy listening. The first thing I saw was a young waitress laughing while I sat there covered in red sauce. Not embarrassed for me, laughing at me. I remember the exact sound of it too. Sharp, quick, mean enough to cut through the clatter of dishes and conversations around the restaurant. And I remember thinking at 68 years old that humiliation somehow hurts worse when you're old. Because when you're young, you still believe people will eventually see your value. When you're old, you start realizing some people stop looking altogether. The young man who had spilled the sauce on me didn't even apologize. He glanced at my stained cardigan and shrugged. Well, he muttered it already looked old anyway. A few people nearby chuckled under their breath. I just sat there. My husband used to say dignity was the one thing nobody could take from you unless you handed it over yourself. That night, I held on to mine by the thinnest thread. Then the waitress leaned toward me and quietly said the sentence that changed everything. "Ma'am, maybe this restaurant is a little too expensive for you." That was the moment I picked up my phone and called Daniel. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how that night really began. My name is Margaret Ellis, and until 3 years ago, I was married to the same man for 45 years. Tom Ellis. He was the kind of man who fixed broken cabinet doors with duct tape because he said buying new things was wasteful. The kind of man who always smelled faintly like coffee and motor oil no matter how many showers he took. And every year on our anniversary, Tom took me to the same restaurant in downtown Columbus, the Grand Willow. Back in the 80s, it wasn't nearly as fancy as it is now. Just a warm little place with good steaks, soft piano music, and cloth napkins that Tom always said made him feel rich. After he died from pancreatic cancer, I stopped going there. Truthfully, after Tom died, I stopped going a lot of places. Grief changes how you move through the world. It makes crowded rooms feel colder somehow. And losing him drained more than my heart. It drained our savings, too. By the time the hospital bills were finished with me, I'd sold Tom's truck, my jewelry, and eventually the little house we raised our boys in before they moved across the country with lives of their own. Now I lived alone in a small apartment outside Columbus, surviving mostly on Social Security and careful budgeting. That morning, I almost talked myself out of going. I stood in front of my closet staring at the same old cardigan I'd worn for years. Brown wool, elbows thinning, one button slightly loose. But it had been Tom's favorite sweater on me. "You always look beautiful in that one, Maggie," he used to say. So I wore it. I curled my gray hair the best I could, put on a little lipstick, even sprayed the last bit of perfume left in an old bottle I'd owned since before Tom got sick. By 6 o'clock, I drove myself downtown in my old Buick, gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual, because night driving wasn't as easy as it used to be. The city looked different now. Everything looked newer, faster, like the whole world had agreed to move on without asking my permission first. The Grand Willow glowed warmly against the dark November evening. Valet attendants hurried around the entrance, while well-dressed couples stepped out of luxury cars laughing. The moment I walked inside, I felt underdressed. Not because anyone had spoken yet. You can just feel it sometimes. The hostess gave me a smile that never reached her eyes. "Reservation." "Yes," I said softly. "Margaret Ellis." She glanced at her screen, then at my clothes, then back at the screen again. For a moment, I honestly thought she might tell me there'd been some mistake. Instead, she grabbed 2 menus and said, "Right this way." She led me past beautiful candle-lit tables near the windows, past the fireplace seating, past the piano, and finally stopped beside a tiny table crammed near the kitchen doors and the restroom hallway. The smell of bleach drifted through every few minutes whenever the restroom door opened. "Oh," I said gently. "I was wondering if maybe there's another table available." Before the hostess could answer, a young waitress with a blonde ponytail appeared beside us. "Everything else is reserved," she said flatly. That was my first introduction to Kayla. I nodded and sat down quietly. But less than 10 minutes later, a younger couple walked in without reservations and got seated beside the windows. I noticed. Kayla noticed me noticing, and from that point on, her attitude toward me somehow became even colder. She brought my water 15 minutes late. Forgot my bread entirely. When I politely asked for butter, she sighed loudly enough for nearby tables to hear. At one point, she dropped a fork on my tablecloth and simply stared at it instead of replacing it. I should have left then. Maybe a younger version of me would have. But older people endure things differently. You swallow discomfort because you're tired of making scenes. You convince yourself kindness still matters. Then the couple beside me started whispering. I tried not to listen, but I heard the woman say, "She looks like she wandered in off the street." Her husband laughed quietly. I stared down at my soup and pretended not to notice. A few minutes later, a waiter carrying steak plates brushed too close to my chair. The customer behind him jerked backwards suddenly and red sauce splashed all across my cardigan. Warm, thick, bright red. The entire table gasped. I looked down in horror. The man barely glanced at me. Well, he muttered it already looked old anyway. And Kayla laughed. I wish I could tell you I stood up for myself right then. I wish I could say I looked that young waitress in the eye and gave her some sharp, clever response that made the whole restaurant ashamed. But that's not what happened. At 68, humiliation doesn't hit you like anger anymore. It settles into your chest quietly, heavier, sadness mixed with exhaustion. I just sat there staring down at the red sauce soaking into the wool cardigan Tom loved so much. For a second, all I could think was how carefully I'd gotten ready that evening. How long it had taken me to curl my hair because my hands shook more these days. How proud I'd felt walking through those restaurant doors, despite not really belonging in places like that anymore. And suddenly I felt foolish for trying. Kayla stood beside my table holding a tray against her hip, not helping, not apologizing, just watching me. Then she leaned down slightly and lowered her voice enough to sound fake polite. "Ma'am, maybe this restaurant is a little too expensive for you." The words landed harder than the sauce. Around me, conversation softened. Not stopped completely, but softened in that uncomfortable way people do when they know something cruel just happened and they don't want to get involved. I looked up at her slowly. "You think that's appropriate to say to someone?" I asked quietly. Her expression tightened for only a second before she shrugged. "I'm just trying to avoid confusion when the bill comes." A couple at the next table laughed under their breath. That did it. Not the insult. Not even the ruined sweater. The laughter. There's something about hearing strangers laugh at you that makes you suddenly aware of your age, your wrinkles, your loneliness. I felt very old sitting there, very alone. I reached for my purse with trembling fingers while Kayla continued standing there impatiently, like she was waiting for me to either leave or cause a scene. Instead, I pulled out my old flip phone. Not many people use those anymore. I noticed Kayla glance at it and smirk. I pressed one number from memory. Daniel answered almost immediately. "Mrs. Ellis." His voice sounded surprised. I swallowed hard before speaking. "Daniel," I said softly, "I think there's a problem at the restaurant." His tone changed instantly. "What happened?" I looked down at the sauce covering my cardigan. "I'd rather explain in person." There was a pause. Then Daniel said quietly, "I'll be there in 5 minutes." I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my purse. Kayla crossed her arms. "Someone coming to help you pay." I stared at her for a long moment, and for the first time all evening, I saw something beyond the attitude. She looked tired. Not physically tired, soul tired. The kind of anger young people carry now that seems to leak out onto whoever happens to be standing nearby. But that didn't excuse what she'd done. "No," I said calmly. "Someone coming to remind this restaurant what hospitality used to mean." Her face hardened immediately. She rolled her eyes and walked away. A minute later, a young manager approached my table. He couldn't have been older than 30. Perfect haircut, expensive watch, tight smile. "Good evening, ma'am," he said. "I understand there may have been some misunderstanding tonight." Misunderstanding. Funny word for humiliation. "I was insulted by your staff," I replied. His smile barely moved. "Well, our servers do their best under pressure." I stared at him. My sweater was ruined. He glanced down briefly. "That appears accidental." The waitress mocked me. He gave a tiny shrug. "I'm sure nobody intended offense." That was when I realized the problem went far beyond one rude waitress. Cruelty spreads in places where people stop correcting it. I suddenly remembered something Tom used to say back when he owned his auto repair shop. The character of a business always starts at the top. The manager placed the check on my table even though I hadn't finished eating. "I'll take care of this personally for you," he said. The implication hung in the air. Pay and leave. I opened the little black folder. $39 for soup, coffee, and humiliation. My hands shook again. Not because of the money. because suddenly I knew exactly how people disappear when they get older. Not physically, socially. People stop seeing you as someone worthy of patience, or dignity, or basic kindness. The couple near me resumed whispering. One woman glanced at my cardigan and whispered loudly enough for me to hear. She probably shouldn't spend her retirement money eating out. That one hurt more than I expected, because after Tom died, money had become a constant shadow hanging over every decision I made. I stopped buying new clothes years ago, stopped getting my hair done professionally, stopped replacing things unless absolutely necessary. You survive quietly when you're old and alone. Most people just never notice. Then suddenly the valet stand outside erupted into movement. Through the front windows, I saw headlights swing sharply into the parking lot. A black SUV pulled up hard enough to make several people near the entrance turn around. Two men in dark suits stepped out first. The young manager beside me frowned immediately, and then Daniel Harper climbed out of the back seat. The entire energy inside the restaurant changed. You could feel it. Staff members straightened instantly. The hostess looked panicked. Even Kayla froze near the kitchen doors. Daniel moved fast once he entered, faster than I'd ever seen him move. He looked around the dining room desperately until his eyes landed on me. Then his expression completely fell apart. He saw the stained cardigan, the untouched soup, the check sitting in front of me, and the look on his face made my stomach tighten. Because suddenly I realized something. Daniel wasn't angry. He was heartbroken. Daniel crossed the dining room so quickly that one of the servers nearly collided with him, carrying a tray of wine glasses. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The entire restaurant seemed frozen in place as he stopped beside my table and stared down at my ruined cardigan. For a moment, he looked exactly like the young man I'd met 25 years earlier. The exhausted cook with grease stains on his shirt and panic in his eyes after the bank rejected his loan application. Only now he wore a tailored charcoal suit worth more than my monthly rent. "Mrs. Ellis," he said softly. His voice cracked. That alone shocked the room. Powerful men aren't supposed to sound emotional in public. Daniel slowly crouched beside my chair, looking at the sauce stains soaking into the wool sweater. What happened here? Nobody answered. Not Kayla, not the manager, not the customers who'd been whispering about me 20 minutes earlier. I tried to save everyone some embarrassment. "It was an accident," I said quietly. "These things happen." Daniel looked up at me immediately, and after all these years, I still recognized that expression on his face. Disappointment. Not in me, in them. Then he noticed the check sitting untouched beside my soup bowl. His jaw tightened. "Why is her bill already on the table?" The young manager cleared his throat nervously. "She seemed upset, sir. I was trying to resolve the situation quickly." "Resolve it," Daniel repeated. His voice wasn't loud. That somehow made it worse. "You resolve situations by humiliating elderly women in front of a full dining room." The manager's face drained of color. Kayla finally stepped forward. "Sir, with all due respect, she was being difficult all evening." I actually closed my eyes for a second when she said that. Because even then, even after everything, I still hoped someone might show a little shame. Daniel stood slowly and turned toward her. "What exactly did she do that was difficult?" Kayla crossed her arms defensively. She complained about the table. Then she started making accusations about service. "The table beside the restroom," Daniel asked coldly. Kayla hesitated. All other seating was reserved. A voice suddenly interrupted from nearby. "That's not true." Everyone turned. An older couple near the windows looked uncomfortable, but the woman continued anyway. "We heard them talking earlier," she admitted quietly. "There were open tables. They just didn't want her sitting up front." The silence afterward felt enormous. Kayla's face went pale. The manager immediately jumped in. "Sir, I can explain." "No," Daniel said sharply. "I think I've heard enough." Then he looked around the room. Really looked. At the guests pretending not to stare. At the servers hovering nervously near the kitchen. At me sitting there with red sauce across my sweater like some public mark of shame. And when Daniel spoke again, his voice carried through the entire restaurant. "Does anyone here know who this woman is?" Nobody answered. Of course they didn't. To them, I was just an old woman in cheap clothes. Daniel nodded slowly. "That's the problem." He walked over to the center of the dining room. "I opened my first restaurant 25 years ago with money loaned to me by two people who believed in me when nobody else did. Every eye in the room followed him now. I had no collateral. Terrible credit. Banks wouldn't even let me finish speaking before rejecting me. His gaze shifted toward me. But Tom and Margaret Ellis invited me into their home anyway. My throat tightened hearing Tom's name spoken out loud. Daniel continued. They gave me enough money to lease my first kitchen space. They trusted me when I had nothing. The manager looked physically ill now. Kayla stood completely motionless. And because of them, Daniel said quietly, "This restaurant exists." A glass shattered somewhere near the kitchen. Nobody even turned toward the sound. Daniel walked back toward my table. Then he said the sentence that changed the entire room. Margaret Ellis still owns 30% of this company. You could actually hear people gasp. One woman covered her mouth. The man who spilled sauce on me suddenly stared at his plate like he wanted to disappear into it. The young manager blinked repeatedly. I didn't know. No, Daniel interrupted coldly. You didn't bother knowing. Kayla looked genuinely shaken now, but she didn't look. She stopped herself too late. Daniel stared at her. She didn't look wealthy enough, he asked. Kayla lowered her eyes. Daniel's disappointment deepened into something heavier. You know, he said quietly, when I was 26 years old, I slept in my car behind a gas station for 3 weeks because I couldn't afford rent. The entire room listened silently. I wore the same 2 shirts every day. People treated me like I was invisible. He paused. Mrs. Ellis never did. I suddenly saw tears forming in Daniel's eyes, and somehow that hurt worse than the humiliation itself, because it reminded me how much time had passed. How many people Tom and I used to know were gone now? Daniel turned toward the manager. Get security footage from tonight. Then toward Kayla. And take off your apron. Her face crumpled instantly. Please, sir. Number? The word cut through the room like ice. The young manager began speaking rapidly. Sir, maybe termination is unnecessary. Daniel turned slowly toward him. She was insulted, neglected, publicly humiliated. A customer assaulted her with food and your staff laughed. Nobody dared move. Then Daniel looked at me again, and softly, so softly only I could hear it, he said, I'm so sorry, Margaret. I looked down at my stained cardigan and thought about Tom, about how proud he used to feel bringing me here. And I realized the thing hurting me most wasn't the cruelty itself. It was knowing how easily people stop seeing humanity in you once you grow old. That night should have ended with me feeling victorious. I suppose that's what most people would expect. The rude waitress exposed. The manager humiliated. The wealthy owner defending me in front of an entire restaurant. But as Daniel drove me home through the cold Ohio night, I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt tired, deeply tired. The kind of tired that settles into your bones after life has humbled you too many times. Rain tapped softly against the windshield while downtown Columbus disappeared behind us in blurred reflections of streetlights and wet pavement. Daniel kept both hands tight on the steering wheel. I still can't believe this happened, he said quietly. Neither could I. But part of me also could, because once you reach a certain age, you begin noticing things younger people don't. You notice how slowly the world stops making room for older folks. Not all at once, little by little. People stop holding eye contact as long. Cashiers become impatient when you count change too slowly. Young people sigh when you ask them to repeat something. Eventually, you start feeling like an inconvenience simply for existing. I stared out the passenger window. When Tom was alive, I said softly, people treated us differently. Daniel glanced toward me. What do you mean? We looked successful back then, and it was true. Tom had owned a small auto repair shop for nearly 30 years. We were never rich, but we were comfortable. We took vacations every summer, hosted Christmas dinners, sent our boys to community college without loans. Back then, people listened when we spoke. Servers smiled longer. Neighbors waved more often. Then cancer came. I still hate that word. Cancer. Such a small word for something that destroys everything around it. Tom fought for nearly 2 years. By the end, we'd emptied our savings, refinanced the house, sold his truck, maxed out credit cards. I would have sold every single thing we owned to keep him alive another month. And honestly, I still would. Daniel's grip tightened on the steering wheel. I should have checked on you more after the funeral, he said quietly. No, I replied gently. You were building a company. That company existed because of you and Tom. I smiled faintly. Tom always believed in people too easily. Daniel shook his head. No, he believed in people before they believed in themselves. That nearly made me cry. We rode in silence for a while after that. When we finally reached my apartment complex, Daniel looked visibly uncomfortable, not judgmental, heartbroken. The building was old, brick faded from years of harsh winters. Half the parking lot lights no longer worked properly. I suddenly became embarrassed. Funny how humiliation lingers after a night like that. I almost apologized for where I lived, but I stopped myself. Number. I had survived too much in life to apologize for surviving. Daniel walked me upstairs carrying my purse because my arthritis had been acting up lately. The hallway smelled faintly of old carpet and somebody's overcooked cabbage dinner. Inside my apartment was small but clean. A beige recliner, family photos, crocheted blankets. Tom's reading glasses still sitting beside his favorite chair, even though he'd been gone 3 years. Daniel noticed them immediately. You kept them there, he said softly. I nodded. Sometimes I still reach for them when I dust. That time I did cry a little. Not loudly, just quietly the way older people often do. Daniel stood in the middle of my living room looking around slowly. I realized then that this was probably the first time he truly understood what life had become for me after Tom died. Not tragic, just smaller, lonelier. He stared at an old framed photograph hanging near the kitchen. Tom and me at the Grand Willow in 1989. I was wearing a navy blue dress. Tom had his arm around my waist. We looked so young, so certain life would stay that way forever. He loved that restaurant, Daniel said. He loved feeling like he'd made it, I replied softly. The truth was, Tom never cared about expensive food. He cared about what the restaurant represented. A reward for years of hard work. A place where ordinary people could sit for one evening and feel special. I slowly removed my stained cardigan and folded it across my lap. The red sauce had soaked deep into the fabric. Ruined. Daniel looked furious all over again. I'm firing all 3 of them tomorrow morning. I surprised both of us by saying, Number. He blinked. No. I shook my head slowly. They should face consequences, I admitted. But humiliation shouldn't be answered with more humiliation. Daniel stared at me in disbelief. Margaret, they mocked you. Yes, I said quietly. And somewhere along the way, they became the kind of people who think cruelty is normal. I looked down at the ruined sweater in my hands. What scares me most, I whispered, is how nobody stopped them. That room went very still after I said that. Because the truth was, the waitress wasn't the only person who failed me that night. So did the customers who laughed. The manager who protected bad behavior. The people who watched silently because it wasn't happening to them. And maybe that's how cruelty survives in this world. Not because of the worst people, but because decent people grow too comfortable looking away. 3 days after the incident at the Grand Willow, my face was everywhere online. Well, not exactly my face. Mostly the stained cardigan. The blurry cell phone footage showed me sitting silently while Kayla stood beside the table with her arms crossed. Someone had uploaded the security clip alongside the caption, "Elderly woman humiliated at upscale restaurant." By the next morning, local news stations picked it up. Then Facebook. Then community pages across Ohio. People were furious. Strangers online called Kayla heartless, cruel, evil. One man commented that she should never work around human beings again. I read those comments sitting alone at my kitchen table with a cup of weak coffee growing cold in my hands. And strangely enough, I didn't feel good about any of it. I knew humiliation. I wouldn't wish it on anybody, even her. Daniel called constantly during those few days. Public relations teams were panicking. Investors wanted statements. Lawyers discussed liability issues. Apparently, when wealthy restaurants publicly mistreat elderly customers, people take it personally, especially older Americans. Daniel wanted to make things right publicly, but I kept refusing interviews. At my age, peace becomes more valuable than attention. Then Thursday evening came. Rain hammered against the apartment windows while I sat crocheting half-heartedly in front of the television. Some old Western Tom used to love played softly in the background. That's when someone knocked at my door. Not a polite knock, a nervous one. I assumed it was Daniel again, but when I opened the door, Kayla stood there soaked from the rain. For a second, neither of us spoke. Without makeup and restaurant lighting, she looked much younger than I remembered. early 20s maybe, and exhausted. Her eyes were swollen red like she'd been crying for hours. "I know you probably hate me," she blurted out immediately. I said nothing. Water dripped from her jacket onto the hallway carpet. Her voice cracked. I needed to say I'm sorry in person. Still, I didn't answer right away, because apologies mean different things when you get older. Young people think saying sorry fixes pain. Older people know some wounds stay tender long after words disappear. "I shouldn't have come," she whispered when I remained silent. Then she turned slightly like she was about to leave, and something inside me softened. Maybe because she suddenly looked less like the cruel waitress from that night and more like a frightened little girl pretending to be tougher than she really was. "It's raining," I said quietly. "You may as well come inside." She looked shocked. My apartment suddenly felt smaller with another person standing inside it. Kayla kept glancing around nervously while I made tea. I noticed her eyes lingering on the old photographs of Tom, the crocheted blankets, the tiny kitchen. I wondered if she expected someone wealthier, bigger. That's the funny thing about people. They think ownership always looks glamorous. After a long silence, Kayla finally spoke. "I lost my job." "I know. My mom won't even answer my calls right now." I handed her a mug carefully. She wrapped both hands around it like she was freezing. Then the tears started. Not pretty movie tears. Real ones. Ugly ones. The kind people cry when they've been holding themselves together too long. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," she whispered. I sat across from her quietly. "No," I said gently, "but you did mean to hurt me." That landed. I could see it physically hit her. She nodded slowly while wiping her eyes. Yes. At least she was honest. Most people aren't anymore. For several minutes, all I heard was rain hitting the windows, and Kayla trying unsuccessfully to stop crying. Finally, she whispered, "My son saw the video." That changed something in her voice. Mothers recognize certain kinds of pain immediately. "He's 8, she said. "Some kid at school showed him the clip online." Her hands shook around the mug. "He asked me why people were calling me cruel." I closed my eyes briefly, because there it was. Consequences. Not corporate consequences. Human ones. "I've been angry for a long time," she admitted quietly. The words spilled out after that. She worked double shifts constantly. Could barely afford daycare. Her ex-boyfriend disappeared 2 years earlier. Rent kept increasing. Her mother helped when she could, but they fought constantly. "I'm tired all the time," she whispered. "And people come into the restaurant acting entitled and rude every day." I listened silently. Then she said something that surprised me. "You reminded me of my grandmother." I looked up. "She used to wear old sweaters like yours." Kayla swallowed hard. "I stopped visiting her before she died." The shame in her face was unbearable to look at. "She used to call me every Sunday," Kayla whispered. Toward the end, I'd ignore the calls because I was busy. Tears rolled down her cheeks again. Then one day, there weren't any calls anymore. The apartment stayed very quiet after that. Finally, I asked softly, "So why were you really cruel to me, Kayla?" She stared into her tea for a long moment before answering. "Because you looked weak," she whispered. "And hurting weak people made me feel strong for a few minutes. Honest. Brutally honest." I leaned back slowly in my chair. Then I asked the question that mattered most. "And how did that strength feel afterward?" Kayla completely broke down. After Kayla broke down crying in my kitchen, neither of us spoke for a while. The rain outside softened into a steady drizzle, tapping gently against the windows like distant fingers. I sat there watching this young woman fall apart in front of me, and strangely enough, I no longer saw the waitress from the Grand Willow. I saw exhaustion, loneliness, fear. The same emotions that quietly destroy people when life becomes too heavy for too long. Kayla wiped her face repeatedly with trembling hands. "I know saying sorry doesn't fix it," she whispered. "No," I replied softly, "it doesn't." She nodded like she expected that answer. "But sometimes," I continued, "a sincere apology is where healing begins." That made her cry harder. I slowly stood and walked toward the kitchen counter, my knees aching the way they always did in cold weather. I refilled our teacups while she tried desperately to regain control of herself. "You know, I said quietly when I was younger I thought cruel people were simply born cruel." Kayla looked up at me weakly. "But getting older teaches you something different." I handed her the tea. "Most cruelty comes from pain. People don't know how to carry." She stared down at the steaming cup. I don't want to be that person anymore. The honesty in her voice reminded me of my youngest son after he got into a fight at school in 7th grade. He'd stood in our kitchen trying not to cry while Tom calmly explained that hurting people only creates more hurt. Tom always had a way of seeing brokenness underneath bad behavior. Maybe that's why Daniel succeeded in life. Tom believed people could become better, even when they didn't deserve the benefit of the doubt. Kayla finally looked around the apartment again. "It's weird," she admitted softly. "What is? I thought rich people lived differently." I almost laughed at that. "Sweetheart," I said gently, "most older people aren't rich. We're just surviving quietly." That seemed to genuinely surprise her. I pointed toward the hallway closet. "My husband and I built a good life once. Then cancer took most of it." Her expression shifted immediately. Not pity, understanding. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I nodded. He was worth every penny we spent trying to save him. And that was the truth. Even now, even after all the debt. I would choose those extra months with Tom again every single time. Kayla stared down into her tea for a long moment before speaking again. "My manager said older customers complain the most." I smiled faintly. "And younger employees roll their eyes the most." To my surprise, Kayla let out a tiny laugh through her tears. The tension in the apartment softened a little after that. Not gone, but softer. Then she asked quietly, "Why didn't you destroy me?" I looked at her carefully. "Daniel could have ruined my life," she continued. "Honestly, after what I did, maybe I deserved it." I thought about that for a while before answering. At my age, you stop seeing life in such simple categories. Good people, bad people, heroes, villains. Reality is usually sadder than that. "I don't believe humiliation teaches the lessons people think it does," I finally said. Kayla frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" I folded my hands carefully in my lap. "When someone humiliates you publicly, the first thing you feel isn't wisdom." I paused. "It's shame." Then anger. She listened quietly. And angry people usually pass pain onto someone else. The room stayed still. I could practically see her thinking through every cruel interaction she'd ever had, every customer she snapped at, every bitter comment, every moment she chose hardness over kindness because hardness felt safer. Then I asked softly, "Has anyone treated you kindly lately?" That question broke her all over again. She covered her mouth and shook her head. Number. Just that one word. Small. Crushed. And suddenly I understood something important. People who receive no grace eventually stop giving grace. That doesn't excuse cruelty, but it explains how it spreads. The next morning, Daniel came to visit. The second Kayla saw him standing in my doorway, she looked terrified. To his credit, Daniel didn't yell, didn't threaten, didn't shame her. He simply looked tired. I came to discuss the training program, he told me gently. Kayla blinked. The what? I invited Daniel inside while he explained the idea forming in his mind overnight. Mandatory hospitality training. Special focus on elderly guests. Patience. Respect. Dignity. The kind of values restaurants used to take pride in before everything became rushed and transactional. Then Daniel looked directly at Kayla. "I want you to help build it." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "You can't be serious." "I am." She stared at him. "After everything I did." Daniel glanced toward me briefly before answering. "The woman you humiliated thinks people deserve second chances." He paused. "I'm trying to trust her judgment." Kayla looked completely overwhelmed. And honestly, so did I. Because right then, sitting together in my tiny apartment, I realized something strange. This story had stopped being about revenge. Somewhere along the way, it had become about whether broken people could still choose to become better human beings. And maybe that mattered more. A year later, I walked back into the Grand Willow wearing the same brown cardigan. The stain was gone now. Mostly. I'd cleaned it 3 different times after that night, but a faint shadow still remained near the sleeve, if you looked closely enough. I kept it anyway. Not because I wanted to remember the humiliation, because I wanted to remember what happened after it. The December air outside carried that familiar Ohio cold that settles deep into your joints. Christmas lights glowed softly along downtown Columbus, while couples hurried past the restaurant windows, bundled in scarves and heavy coats. For the first time in years, I didn't feel nervous walking inside. The hostess opened the door before I even reached for it. "Good evening, Mrs. Ellis," she said warmly. Not fake warm. Real warm. That still surprised me sometimes. Inside the restaurant looked different than it had a year earlier. Not physically, emotionally. You can feel when a place changes. Staff members moved with more patience now. Servers actually looked customers in the eye. Older guests no longer sat isolated near the kitchen, while younger couples occupied all the comfortable seating. Daniel had kept his promise. The training program had become mandatory across every Grand Willow location in Ohio. And somehow, unbelievably, Kayla became one of its strongest instructors. I spotted her immediately near the dining room entrance, helping a nervous young waiter carry a tray properly. She looked different too. Still young, still tired around the eyes sometimes, but softer now, less angry. When she noticed me, her entire face brightened. "Mrs. Ellis." She crossed the room quickly and hugged me carefully. A year ago, I never would have imagined that moment. "You came," she said. "I said I would." She smiled. Then she glanced down at the cardigan and froze slightly. "You kept it." I did. Her eyes filled with emotion immediately. "I still think about that night all the time." "I know," I said gently, "and I still hate myself for it sometimes." I reached over and squeezed her hand. "That feeling means you changed." She swallowed hard but nodded. The restaurant buzzed softly around us with Christmas music and quiet conversations. For once, nobody was staring at me. Nobody looked embarrassed by my clothes. Nobody treated me like I didn't belong. Daniel appeared moments later from the back office. And to my surprise, he looked nervous. Before dinner, he said carefully, "There's something I want to show you." He guided me toward the far side of the dining room near the fireplace. The moment I saw the wall, I stopped walking. There, hanging in a large black frame beneath a warm overhead light, was an old photograph of Tom and me. The same photo from my apartment, the one taken at the Grand Willow in 1989. Tom's arm wrapped around my waist, my navy blue dress. Our young smiling faces frozen in time before illness and age touched either of us. Below the photograph was a small brass plaque. It read, "Respect costs nothing, but it can change everything." My throat closed instantly. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Daniel stood quietly beside me. "I wanted people to remember what this place was supposed to mean," he said softly. I touched the edge of the frame gently. Tom would have cried seeing that. Honestly, so did I. Not loudly, just enough for the world to blur a little. Kayla stood nearby, wiping her eyes too. And suddenly I realized something strange. The memory that once hurt most no longer owned me anymore. Because now when I thought about that terrible night, I didn't only remember humiliation. I remembered what came afterward. Growth, grace, second chances, healing. Daniel led me back toward the dining room. And this time, instead of the terrible little table beside the restroom, they seated me near the fireplace beneath soft golden lights. The best seat in the restaurant. Kayla personally served my dinner that evening. Tom's favorite meal, prime rib with mashed potatoes. When she placed the plate in front of me, her hands trembled slightly. I used to think strength meant never slowing down for anyone, she admitted quietly. Now I think maybe real strength is making people feel seen. I smiled at her. That's a harder lesson than most people ever learn. As I ate dinner, I looked around the restaurant carefully. An elderly man laughed with his wife near the piano. A teenage server patiently helped an older woman read the menu without rushing her. Nobody seemed invisible tonight. And maybe that was enough. Maybe changing one small corner of the world still mattered. By the time dessert arrived, snow had started falling outside the windows. Soft, peaceful, beautiful. The kind of snowfall Tom loved. Before I left, Daniel walked me to the entrance personally. "You know," he said quietly, "people online still call this your revenge story." I smiled faintly. "They're wrong." He looked at me curiously. I glanced back toward the warm dining room behind us. "No," I said softly. "Revenge would have been destroying them." I paused. This was something better. Daniel nodded slowly, like he finally understood. Outside, snowflakes landed gently against my cardigan as I prepared to head home. And for the first time in a very long while, I didn't feel invisible anymore. If this story meant something to you, maybe let it serve as a reminder that every person you pass carries burdens you cannot see. Sometimes the smallest kindness becomes the thing someone remembers for the rest of their life. And if you've ever felt overlooked, dismissed, or underestimated because of your age, your appearance, or your circumstances, I hope you remember this. Your dignity does not disappear just because the world becomes too distracted to notice it. Thank you for spending this evening with me. And if this story touched your heart, feel free to share it with someone who still believes kindness matters. If you enjoyed this story, feel free to share it and subscribe for more emotional, true-to-life narratives. Thank you for listening.